All right, I'd like to welcome you back to our study of Revelation. We're in the study of the churches right now, and today we're going to be talking about the church at Smyrna. It's found in chapter 2, verses 8 through 11. All right, the city of Izmir, I-S-M-I-R, is the second largest city of modern Turkey today, and it's built on the ruins of Smyrna. There's not much insight as to how the city appeared. There's one excavation with a long tunnel beneath the city of Izmir, which leads to Mount Pegasus, which is modern Mount Kataphekala. And in all of Asia, at the time, there was no city more beautiful than Smyrna. The geographical setting was beautiful. The architecture was beautiful and organized. There was some kind of plan put together about how they were going to build things and what style and whatever, something like that. There was a panoramic view. It came to be called, because of the beauty of it and just the nature of the surroundings, it came to be called a crown by some people. It came to be called a flower by some people, and it came to be called a statue by some people. I don't know where they get all that, but those were just some of the words used to describe it. It's the birthplace of Homer. It's for Christians, Smyrna became well known as the place of the execution of Polycarp, one of the most famous early martyrs. He was bishop of the church at Smyrna. He was executed in February 23rd, 155 AD. Some have suggested that Polycarp was the angel or the pastor of the church at Smyrna, the one that the letter was addressed to. Polycarp knew John. That's confirmed by Irenaeus, one of the historians of the day. He lived from. It was that he confirmed that in somewhere around 130. Somewhere between 130 and 200 AD. He was a faithful teacher who always taught the things he learned from the apostle. All right, let's look at verse 8. To the angel of the church in Smyrna, write, these are the words of him who is the first and the last, who died and came to life again. No question but what these are the words of Jesus. I've got a red letter edition of the Bible. These are words in red. The first and the last do not differ from the meaning of the Alpha and the Omega from our previous verses that we studied when we were talking about Ephesus, I believe. He is the one who precedes creation, and he is the one who is there when it's gone. And he is the one who died and came to life again. The literal translation of the Greek is the one who died and is alive again. This reference to the last and the one who is alive again must be refreshing to those who are about to suffer through persecution and possible death. That's where we get our emphasis. It's on our hope. That's what we look forward to. They were living it. They were in the process of being persecuted, even to the possibility of death, as I said before. All right, verse 9. Verse 9 says this, I know your afflictions and your poverty, yet you are rich. I know about the slander of those who say they are Jews and are not, but are of a synagogue of Satan. He says, I know your afflictions and your poverty, yet you are rich. He says, I know the slander from those who are not Jews, but they are of a synagogue of Satan. In AD 70, the Jerusalem and the temple were destroyed. There was growing hostility towards Christians by the Jews at that time, and the crisis point came in AD 90. A document called the Curse of the Minim, M-I-N-I-M, was the official document divesting Jewish Christians from synagogue worship. They were basically thrown out of the synagogues. They were no longer allowed to worship in synagogue. Essentially, this put the Christians in a position, if they wanted to continue worshiping in the synagogue, it put them in a position of one of two things. Either they would have to deny Christ and embrace Judaism, or be prepared for serious persecution from the Romans, because then they would be considered some kind of religious sect. The Romans liked the Jews because they were orderly. If these Christians were no longer allowed to be identified with Jews, then they were going to be in danger of additional persecution from the Romans. Okay, in the words, I know your afflictions and your poverty, the Greek word for affliction actually means extensive tribulation. Now, when you read affliction, that's kind of tame sounding. It doesn't sound good, but when you actually understand the actual Greek, it's really bad. It actually means extensive tribulation, which gives it a little more intensive slant than the English translation of affliction. Basically, this is serious business. The Greek word for poverty, so we're looking at understated translation here. The Greek word for poverty is not general poverty, but denial of the basics of life. So Jesus says, I know your affliction. If you were to restate it, the restatement would be, I know the intense tribulation you are going through, as well as the deprivation of the basics, necessities of life, yet you are rich. The declaration of them being rich has to do with riches in heaven, something I'm sure the world today and then did not understand. What are your thoughts on this about being rich? Do you think the tendency What are your thoughts on this about being rich? Do you think the tendency is to run back to Judaism and avoid persecution, or stay the course and take your lumps, maybe even death? He said, I know the tribulations you're going through. I know how poor you really are. He said, but you're rich. They could avoid, a lot of that comes through tribulation, comes through persecution. If they were to deny Christ, they could call themselves Jews again, and that would allow them to avoid all of that. Remember, Hebrews, they are drifting. If you recall what was going on with the Hebrews, in the book of Hebrews, there were Christians. There was probably persecution going on with them, and they were in danger of drifting back to Judaism. Paul said, don't do it. Remember what you learned. He said, Paul said, to live is Christ, to die is gain, is what he said in Philippians. What does this mean? In the face of persecution and maybe even death. To live is Christ, to die is gain. This was a reality for them. Western New Testament Christians, that live where we live, at least for the time being, are not faced with that decision. To live is Christ, to die is gain. We're living, but we're not in danger of dying under persecution in the United States. Is this easy to talk about in the West? We're not facing death. I just think I just got ahead of my notes. Just a little lightweight persecution. You should think about this because someday, maybe not, we may have to face it. Just because we don't go through the tribulation, just because we're not going to go through the tribulation does not mean we won't have to endure suffering. It just won't be like the tribulation. They were being slandered by Jews. Remember John 6. In fact, I want to read that. John 6, verses 53 to 58. This is kind of a shocker. It's not something we read all that often. John 6, verses 53 to 58. Jesus said to them, very truly, I tell you, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in you. Whoever eats my flesh and drinks my blood has eternal life, and I will raise them up at the last day. For my flesh is real food and my blood is real drink. Whoever eats my flesh and drinks my blood remains in me, and I in them. Just as the living Father sent me, and I live because of the Father, so the one who feeds on me will live because of me. This is the bread that came down from heaven. Your ancestors ate manna and died, but whoever feeds on the bread will live forever. Sounds like cannibalism. Eating his body, drinking his blood. Jesus was actually talking about discipleship, following him, being one with him. Not literally eating his body and drinking his blood. But probably, we were talking just here in Revelation about them being slandered. They were being slandered probably as being called cannibals, Christian people, the people that stuck with him. There was a lot of people that deserted him that day. But Christians still live under those verses, and they were being slandered as being cannibals. They had love feast and were accused of immorality because of the name, love feast. Fires of divine judgment they talked about. Fires of the Spirit brought accusations of being arsonists. This is the ways they were slandered. Because of their unwillingness to pay homage to Caesar, they were accused of disloyalty to Rome. And on it goes. These Jews are not Jews at all, but Jesus accuses them of being a synagogue of Satan. John is not necessarily referencing the ethnicity, but on the order of what Paul said in Romans 9, 6 through 8, not all descended from Israel are Israel. Meaning those who claim to be God's people are not all God's people, but they are a synagogue of Satan. So they were slandering him in various ways. And John is saying they're coming from a synagogue of Satan. The true Jew is one living in obedience to God, which means following Christ. God sent his Son as the Messiah, whom they rejected. We know that those who are alive will continue to have opportunity to accept Christ. For those who do not accept him, the result will be the same for those who rejected God in the Old Testament, and that is Hades. All right, let's look at verse 10. Still talking about Smyrna. Do not be afraid of what you are about to suffer. I tell you, the devil will put some of you in prison to test you, and you will suffer persecution for 10 days. Be faithful even to the point of death, and I will give you life as your victor's crown. All right, my notes are all over the page here, so bear with me. I hope I can stay up with them. The Smyrnans are encouraged not to fear what is about to happen to them. Some kind of suffering he's talking about. But instead of promising them for God to take them out of it, Jesus lets them know that the devil has plans. Some will go to prison. Some will experience tribulation and persecution for 10 days, it says. Some should anticipate martyrdom, even death. Just because they won't disavow or deny Christ. This probably is not the devil himself, but he has his dominion, and his fingers seem to be into everything, as he is today. So what is the 10 days all about? I don't know. I don't know, and I can't find anybody else that knows either. We are in need of revelation on this point. Sooner or later we'll get it, I'm sure. It could be related to numerology. It plays into a complete number for thorough persecution. It could be 10 separate persecutions. It could be 10 days of imprisonment before gladiatorial combat. That seems reasonable, but this would also indicate that gladiatorial combat was going on at that time, which we don't know for sure that it was. One of the commentaries also says that 10 days of detention, it could be 10 days of detention before being released. The 10 days does not apply to anything eschatological. That's the only thing I think we can say for certain. Remember, these letters to the churches are what Jesus referred to as the what is now in John 1:19. He totally read that one again. John 1:19. John was instructed, write therefore what you have seen, what is now, and what will take place. The what is now, the what he has seen is chapter 1 basically. What is now is chapter 2 and 3, which is the churches, and what is to take place will be chapter 4 through 22. But this was, so because he's talking about what is now, we know it doesn't relate to the eschatology. It's what is now. It's what's going on with the churches now. So it's not anything way off there in the distant future. So it's just something we'll have to look for God to give us a revelation on later. All right. The reward for being faithful is a crown of life. Being faithful, those who are martyred are the faithful. This is a victor's crown. The Greek is Stephanos. It's a victor's crown. It's a wreath, that like one you would get at an athletic event at the time. It's not a diadem crown. It's not a gold crown like royalty would wear, like a king would wear. So their reward, the faithful, for being faithful even unto death, is a victor's crown. Not in recognition of royalty, but more as a victorious athlete would be awarded. So rather than being losers unto death, they are winners if they die. All right, let's look at verse 11. Whoever has ears, let him hear what the Spirit says into the churches. The one who is victorious will not be hurt at all by the second death. I don't know if you noticed or not, I talked about all the churches except for a couple get a praise and they get a rebuke. This is one of the churches that does not get a rebuke. I think the other one is Philadelphia. These guys, the guys that were known for the tribulation and persecution they're going through and the affliction they're going through and their extreme poverty, they were told they were rich. Jesus had nothing bad to say about them. So that's just something to put in the back of your memory to remember for later, because we're going to see that when we look at the churches, the good parts and the not so good parts that Jesus has some rebuke to say about, it's things that we can learn from for our churches of today. It's very important. All right, verse 11, let me read it again. Whoever has ears, whoever has ears, let them hear what the Spirit says to the churches. The one who is victorious will not be hurt at all by the second death. Those who overcome, those who are victorious, are those who have a sincere faith in Jesus, for that is the only real faith that there is. It's not perfect, unfailing faith, but faith which comes from the heart. These are the same people to get a victor's crown in verse 10. The ones that overcome, the ones that are faithful. They may not be martyred because they're still here, but they're still the faithful. These will not be hurt by, but protected from the second death. I don't know if you've studied much about the second or heard about the second death, but John later talks about the second death in chapter 20. We're going to look at some of that. Second death is not a good place to be. These guys are going to be protected from the second death. They won't have to go through it. Look at chapter 20, verse 6. Chapter 20, verse 6. This is the first resurrection of what he just read. Blessed and holy are those who share in the first resurrection. The second death has no power over them, but they will be priests of God and of Christ and will reign with him for 1,000 years. Christian people will not have to go through the second death. We're going to see what the second death is. See what else I want to read to you. Look at verse 14 and 15 in chapter 20 as well. Then death and Hades are thrown into the lake of fire. The lake of fire is the second death. Anyone whose name was not found in the book of life was thrown into the lake of fire. For the person whose name is not in the book of life, the Lamb's book of life, the Christians will not be thrown. Whoever's name is in the Lamb's book of life is a Christian. He will be spared from going through the second death. He's going straight to eternal life. The one whose name is not found in the Lamb's book of life, has an eternal destination of the lake of fire for eternity. Okay, so you go back to the verse 11 for Smyrna. Let's see if I skipped anything there. Oh yeah, the second death happens at the great white throne judgment. This is a little preview for what we're going to see when we get to to chapter 20. I once asked a person if they would rather, if you had a choice, and the two choices were to be at the judgment seat of Christ or be at the great white throne judgment, which would you choose? And she said, well, I'd take the great white throne judgment. The great white throne judgment. Sounds pretty, doesn't it? The judgment seat of Christ sounds bad. It's just the opposite of what you think. The judgment seat of Christ is only for Christians. We're going to be talking about this. It's not in Revelation, but it's going to be one of our special studies. The judgment seat of Christ is only for Christians. That's where rewards are handed out. The great white throne judgment is the final judgment. There will be no judgment after that. That is where the dead are judged, the dead in Christ. They will be resurrected to stand before Jesus at the great white throne judgment, and he will be thrown into the lake of fire. The parable of the sheep and the goats may play into, I'm not ready to say that yet, but it may play into part of the great white throne judgment. It may be somewhere else. I'm still out on that one. By the time we get to it, I'll be ready to tell you. But that's what we're talking about. The victorious, the ones that overcome in verse 11 of Revelation 2 are the ones that will not go through the second death. They are delivered from that. Okay, the last thing I want to say on this is that there are many judgments. There's the sheep and the goats judgment, which will cover, and several others. There's Daniel, I think it was Daniel 2 or Daniel 12. There's stuff that Jesus said. There's all kinds of judgments that occur at various times. I don't mean the bowls and the trumpets, those kind of judgment. I'm talking about judgment where you stand before God and he's going to declare something to you, either something good or something bad, usually something bad. But we're going to talk about those later, but I just wanted you to know that when he's talking about, when we went through chapter 20 here, we're talking about being delivered from the second death. That means that you're spared from going through the great white throne judgment. There's other judgments too. We're going to talk about all of them. So I guess that's all I have for you today on the church at Smyrna. So the next church that we'll talk about is the church at Pergamum. Thank you very much.